Everybody enjoying your dinner? How about that dessert sculpture? Very Bauhaus, very Bauhaus, very wonderful, very tasty. The Bauhaus was a revolutionary educational experiment both within the classroom and beyond. Masters and students alike participated in a number of extracurriculars, including legendary parties, theater, and most famously, Oskar Schlemmer's triadic ballet. Tonight, we have a special Bauhaus performance, a dance performance inspired by the Bauhaus, brought to you by Hedwig Dances, which is a contemporary dance company led by Jan Bartosek. They create, perform, and cultivate dance within communities of audiences, dancers, and artists to provoke human connection and wonder. Please help me welcome Olivia Gonzalez from Hedwig Dances, and please enjoy this creative ode to Oskar Schlemmer. We would have called that a typical Friday night in Dessau. So thank you to Hedwig Dances for that. And it relates to the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is dynamic and complex. It is certainly impossible for us to cover all facets in just 3 days. Tomorrow we dive into how the school materialized and how it operated. Tuesday we explore its disbanding and the influence it had around the world, as well as the legacy that remains today. But tonight, Bergdoll and Leah Dickerman, curators of MoMA, exhibit Bauhaus 1919 to 1993, Workshops of Modernity, will give us a preview of what's to come by discussing 10 key principles for understanding what the Bauhaus was and was not, and why it has continued to be so important to modern culture. Please help me welcome Barry Bergdoll and Leah Dickerman.
Want me to lead off?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, 10 years ago,
10 years ago, Leah and I, this is a reunion for us. 10 years ago, we culminated a several-year project at the Museum of Modern Art for the 90th anniversary of the Bauhaus. Very clever, because we didn't need to compete with everybody who needs the Bauhaus things that are circulating around the world in this centennial year. And as we discussed how we were going to grasp the Bauhaus in an exhibition and all of its facets, all of the media that came together there, the one mantra that we gave ourselves, and is the first that we want to give you, so we've organized this as a series of statements. We might not always totally agree, but we're going to have a conversation about these. But this was essentially the motto that we gave ourselves for the show. The Bauhaus is not a style, but a school.
and we're playing a game here because we have 10 principles and we're going to give ourselves 3 minutes for each of the 10.
We're supposed to be watching the time countdown. I think already having chosen the rediscovered, very colorful African chair by Marcel Breuer and Gunnar Stölzel, there already emphasizes the point that what you think is Bauhaus style is not embodied by the object that you see on the screen. And so our principle for the things that we gathered together in the exhibition was that everything that was shown in the exhibition was created at the Bauhaus by a creator, be they student or master, while they were at the Bauhaus. Your entire life before and after the Bauhaus was not suddenly part of some Bauhaus style of eternal principles. Bringing all those things together brought together the fact that the Bauhaus, like a school that was dynamic and exciting and could have the influence that we've come together to discuss, was a place where ideas were continually exchanged, and therefore the visual products of the Bauhaus, even if we might search for some unifying principles, did not have an outward look. I'll just say one more thing as I'm watching the countdown before handing it over to Leah. This is not a later historian's problem. Already the Bauhaus struggled terribly with the notion that in its own time, people began to refer to the things that the Bauhaus was making as reflecting Bauhaus style. And they retaliated against this, and they were caught in this very fascinating conundrum. So I think it's one of the things we'll be discussing for the coming.
And one of the things that they worried about with the idea of style is it means that it would have been set already. That it would have been a set of principles that were received, and then you would create objects in relationship to a known set of rules. And the mantra of the Bauhaus was learning through experience, even trying to take yourself back to this tabula rasa moment where you were learning anew. So we could even go further and say that Bauhaus wasn't a style but a school. It was actually two schools coming together, the Academy of Fine Arts and the School of Applied Art and Design. And the first faculty, or the faculty throughout its 14 years, pulled together architects, designers, fine artists. And I think in retrospect, its greatest legacy might have been that kind of purposeful diversity that was there from the very beginning, of holding a faculty together for over 14 years in a moment of great instability and political turbulence to discuss again and again in different moments what it meant to be an artist, what technology meant, which an emerging media culture meant, what rising right politics meant, and to play these questions out across a faculty of extraordinary thinkers and sparkling students. That kind of conversational body is really important for us to think about now. And what emerged wasn't a style, but many propositions that were often at variance with each other. And I think that's something that is an important legacy for us to think about. What does it mean to hold a school together across many disciplines and talk about how art matters in the world?
I think we're obliged to go on to the next principle, because we're on a time.
Okay, so even though Walter Gropius founded the school in 1919 in order to produce architects and craftsmen, the first faculty that he invited were painters. And that's an extraordinary thing. Most of the faculty that he invited first were chosen from around the gallery in Berlin called Der Sturm. It was a gallery, it was a journal, expressionist artists. And in inviting painters into this school of applied arts and architecture, they created a proposition that was very radical and maybe ultimately one of the most enduring aspects of the Bauhaus legacy. Starting with Johannes Itten, who was teaching in Vienna, they created a preliminary course, and the preliminary course was a strong counterpoint to academic training, traditional academic training that had been around since the 17th century, in which students of art would study models and copy them, or models in galleries, or sometimes models from the nude. And instead, they created a curriculum that was shared by students across the entire school. The curriculum endured for the entire 14 years, in which students learned about the fundamental language of art making, of mark making, of color, of line, this language at its very beginning. So it was a language of abstraction, really, in this moment in which abstraction was totally new. And that legacy of the preliminary course is something that you see through art schools still today.
I think one of the most interesting things about the presence of these painters in a school that was not really training painters, it wasn't set up as a place to create the future painters and sculptors per se, but had this vision of abolishing a distinction between the fine arts and the useful arts. One of the key principles is this initially striking paradox that painters were so important to it. But I think for Gropius, that meant that the dialogue that he wanted to set up between artistic values, between formal values and technical values, always in conversation. So I think one thing in the legacy of the Bauhaus is when it gets consumed in the notion of a kind of radical machine functionalism is an absolute reduction of what he was after. From the beginning was this conversation between a kind of liberated, non-imitative, non-historicist way of thinking through artistic and form problems with the what would happen when that met materials and techniques. So that one was not going to be dictated to either by the pragmatics of materials nor by any received conventions or notions of art making. Look. We have a timer that we're playing with, so you don't see what a tense exercise this is for us.
Okay, Barry,
So
I think you lead her.
this is, how have we gotten to the third principle? We haven't even taken on this name. Simultaneously, this name that is weird, but also extraordinarily memorable. If it were meant to be called the State School of Fine and Applied Arts fusion together and never to be subdivided, you would not remember its name. But Bauhaus, you remember. And the very concept of this word, this German invented word, of course, German lends itself to inventing new words and new concepts, from the word for building and of house. And I think a number of the principles are going to lead us to question to what extent we must understand the seeming predominance of architecture as a literal thing or a metaphorical thing. This is, of course, one of the versions of the famous diagram of the curriculum that led in its outer ring from the preliminary course here called the basic course in this particular rendering of it through the specialization of students in materials and activities, all leading to that kind of central target called building. So one of the great paradoxes, since the school was founded, as Leah said, from this fusion of two schools by Walter Gropius, himself a trained architect with a traditional architectural training, with an architectural practice, with quite a lot of architectural experience behind him, creating a school called the House of Building, coming up with a curricular diagram in which everything was aimed towards building. One of the paradoxes of this is that it took 8 years before architecture was actually taught at the Bauhaus. Now, you've heard over and over again that the Bauhaus lasted for 14 years, so that means that slightly under 50% of its short existence was there a formal architectural training at the Bauhaus.
On the
I'm
other
watching
hand,
the clock,
yeah.
so I think you have to
On
pick
the
up.
other hand, the idea of architecture was very useful as a metaphor. And in Gropius's founding manifesto, the Bauhaus Manifesto of 1919, he spoke about all the arts, sculpture, painting, glassmaking, ceramics coming together under the aegis of a new architecture. And the idea of architecture had all that in it, the idea of bringing the disciplines together, imagining the craftsman as an artist. It had the idea of collective labor. It had the idea of integrating a notion of social function into art. It even had an idea of Gesamtkunstwerk in it, of bringing everything together into a synthetic whole. And these were very important animating principles in the Bauhaus pedagogy, even if architecture wasn't being taught.
Footnote, academic has to add a footnote. The students could go to a local technical college where there was architectural instruction. So it wasn't that there was no architecture instruction, but it had not yet been folded in.
Right,
to
and
the
there were
curriculum
some
inside
important
the
building projects taking place with the faculty. Georg Mucke was building a house, the Sommerfeld House. There were a lot of ways that students might have gotten their hands in an aspect of an architectural project. So the next one is mine, which is the idea that the women led a quiet revolution. And this is not to say that the Bauhaus wasn't full of gender bias. And in fact, most women were ushered in to the weaving workshop or the ceramic workshop, whether they wanted to be or not. In fact, women who wanted to be architects were ushered into the weaving workshop. But the form master of the weaving workshop was an expressionist painter named Georg Mucke, who did his best to say that he wanted to have nothing to do with weaving itself. He didn't want to weave a tapestry or a wall hanging himself, and he was really only interested in the weaving workshop to the extent that it might provide a revenue stream for the school. And in one of those, and he would paint pictures and he would give them to the women to weave. In one of those moments in which a little absence is very productive, however, the women organized themselves. Women like Gunther Stutzel and Benita Ada-Koch organized themselves, and they created a new governance structure within the weaving workshop, which was much more collective and much more collaborative. And they also rejected the idea of weaving that was based on pictures that were handed to them. And instead, they committed themselves to an idea of weaving that was based on the grid and the warp and the weft that's inherent in weaving. And in fact, many of their explorations of this grid logic that you can see in this beautiful Gunther Stutzel tapestry here ultimately then had impact on the male artists and artisans in the school, including, for instance, seeing weavings by Annie Albers that play with the grid metaphor before Joseph Albers began using the same types of images in his glass paintings. So quietly, by organizing a collective governance structure and creating a new type of formal logic based on the material properties of weaving, the women weavers influenced the way that grids and the language of painting was thought about and discussed in the Bauhaus.
And ironically, I think as you found out in the research around the exhibition and drawing also on the lot of work that's been done on textiles at the Bauhaus, one could say polemically that it was in the textiles, which we might think of as one of the most crafty parts of the Bauhaus. You know, the weaving and the ceramics, and an old line is that, of course, the women were pushed towards these more traditional craft-based things. Maybe the guys would go deal with the things that were more related to the emerging industrial aesthetic, but it was actually a transformation of the technology of the weaving machines. In some ways, there was more machine culture in the literally present day to day in the practice of the textile workshops than in many others. We don't have the image of the Bauhaus Manifesto, the famous cathedral. I think it was already evoked by the Herbert Bayer's legacy on stage here. But we wanted to make the claim that the most important symbol, despite the call, you know, to come to the Bauhaus of that manifesto with its image of the cathedral as the total work of art in a woodcut. It was something that fell into the hands of people like Breuer, perhaps Bayer, and gave them the idea to go not to Berlin or to some metropolis to study, but to a small provincial town of Weimar. But by the time the school was up and running and thinking about how it might even move beyond the bounds of the building that it had inherited from the schools that were fusioned together to create the Bauhaus, the idea of creating the home had really, we're proposing, become the great metaphor for thinking. And so the total work of art that was a building moved from this image of the cathedral with all of its evocation of the guild culture and the combination of all of the arts in the medieval cathedral, really a 19th century notion taken over, to the idea that the modern artist would recreate the domestic sphere, that the Bauhaus would not simply create objects, but that it would recreate the very notion of modern living. And the house would, of course, be the Bau, or the framework in which that would happen.
And with that, there was a shift in the types of things that were discussed and talked about. So instead of a glass workshop and a ceramic workshop, much more emphasis on textiles, weaving, furniture making, ultimately wallpaper as well. So that metaphor of the home, or the emphasis on the home, began to change the activities of the Bauhaus.
Now here, this image just before it leaves us could very well also be part of the quiet revolution led by the women at the Bauhaus, because what you're looking at is the Bauhaus Demonstration House of 1923, from their first major exhibition of what they had all collectively been up to. This is an image that we particularly like because it looks from the children's playroom into the kitchen. The implication is that perhaps, on one hand, seems to reinforce traditional values. Maybe the housewife will be in the kitchen watching the children play in the adjacent space. On the other hand, this complete reconceptualization of the children's room next to the kitchen as a kind of mini Bauhaus for children. So the relationship of thinking about children and child's education through the preliminary course, but then actually in the life of the house. So this wonderful furniture designed by one of the great inventive women artists at the Bauhaus, Alma Buscher-Seedhoff, included furniture that the children could transform, turning the stool into a little wheeled device, opening the cabinet door and making the cupboard into a playroom, or into a stage, actually, quite literally what we're on, a stage for performing marionette or playing probably with approved Bauhaus toys.
So in the preliminary course, there was an emphasis on looking for a fundamental language of visual form, made out of point and texture and color and plane. And when Herbert Bayer got to the Bauhaus, he put almost as much emphasis in rethinking what a fundamental language would be for graphic form and for the alphabet. So from 1922 to 1928, he worked on creating a new alphabet for the modern era. And one of the things that he was really taking as a point of departure, or as a point of something to leave behind was the German type called fracture, which was used in all kinds of business correspondence at the time and was based on handwritten calligraphic type. It was still entered into the 20th century, even though it was a letterpress type. And so Bayer worked on rationalizing letter forms using the tools of an engineer, like a compass and a ruler and a curve, to create what he understood as a fully efficient modern language built of parts that could be combined and recombined. And in doing this, one of the things he was doing was trying to create a letter form that would be a universal letter form, not one that would speak of German culture, but one that could move in an unfettered way across political boundaries. So to think in these terms, creating a universal letter form that could move easily across boundaries, that wouldn't be carrying traces of German nationalism, is a really important thing if you're thinking of what's happening politically in this moment. This is a political position that he is taking as a graphic designer. And you can see other activities at the Bauhaus that are similar to that. Hugh Schmidt, who ran the woodworking workshop, created a chess set that he intended to demilitarize the traditional figures of the chess knights and kings and rooks and bishops to create an abstract, diagrammatic chess form. So it's setting this abstract language against a nationalist position that is some of the ways that the politics would come into the objects that you see of the Bauhaus.
Yes, not the least that with the rise of the National Socialists, a celebration of factor, of returning to traditional type. So this is the graphic design, and I'm sure we'll be discussing this over the coming days, was anything but an innocent activity of simply searching for underlying universal forms. It was a debate between universalism and nationalisms that
took place, and when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they would return the lettering on train stations to a facture type again.
Just one footnote, because I can't resist footnotes before we leave this image, which is this is an advertisement for a lecture by the architect Hans Pölzig. And we don't associate Hans Pölzig with the Bauhaus. So I think it does also make the important point for us in the coming days that as much as we might want to think about the curriculum, who was a student, who was a professor, many people passed through the Bauhaus. Many people were on the edge of the Bauhaus. It was not as formalized as an institution as we might think of as either a late 19th century art school or, for that matter, and this goes to what the Bauhaus people who came to America found, Gropius at Harvard. Dealing at Harvard University is a little bit different than being able to reinvent the school every semester and dealing with outsiders who want to cluster around it, who might have as much immediate impact on the students through a lecture series or a charismatic
Well, not only that,
performance.
there was the Bauhaus book series.
Yes.
So 8 books that were published in 1925, but there was a plan to publish, I think, almost 50 volumes. And among the books that were ultimately published were Malevich and Mondrian, Corbusier, Moholy-Nagy. So all of these texts that address the issues of modernity in the modern world were part of the Bauhaus publishing series, and then in that way taken in within the aegis of the kinds of conversations that were taking place at the school.
Kind of trying to make a crossroads of the avant-gardes in a certain way. So despite the fact that there was, and this led to its many moves and its politicization, there was state financing. In fact, the Bauhaus's status changes in terms of its relationship to government and to central funding, nonstop political battles over that, because it was not, until the very end, a private school. Nonetheless, the Bauhaus had a relatively novel idea of having a revenue stream from the sales of the things that it would make. And therefore, it was also always in negotiations with manufacturers, because despite the factory look of the building, it was actually not a factory, and it was not possible to produce things there on a factory scale. And so in order to create some of the Bauhaus products, often either they were in reality very much put together under the image of industry but crafted in their making, or there was a negotiation with an outside manufacturer or distributor. One of the most surprising facts, so we wanted some of these facts to maybe a little bit shock you, maybe send you out to the bookstore to see, is this really true or are they exaggerating, is that this business model never actually functioned, even though there was a full-time business manager at the Bauhaus, with the exception of one of the most successful products that the Bauhaus came up with, which was Bauhaus-designed wallpaper. So when we think of modern architecture as being that which refuses any transformation of the surface of the architecture beyond the reality of its materials, that borrowed American slogan of form versus function, the fact that the Bauhaus would be designing wallpaper is already something we have to get our minds around. And secondly, that it should be so successful. In fact, one of the rare things that we included an image of in the catalog was of a wallpaper being still marketed, even in National Socialist times, under the name Bauhaus, even though the National Socialists had closed the school.
There's a different way you can see of thinking about form here, because instead of the grid logic that you might have seen in some of the earlier Bauhaus work, now the kind of mark that's being made in the wallpapers is this small mark that's repeated again and again until it becomes a kind of overall patterning. And you could see in thinking about the wallpaper that Bauhaus students would do it with almost anything. You could rub with chalk to create a wallpaper pattern. Some of Alber's students made wallpaper patterns with repeated typewriter units. So it's this, again, this small mark that's done again and again and again. And it had the idea, it ended up creating a transition from an idea of pattern and ornament to texture. And texture was one of the really important ideas that came out of Bauhaus teaching, that you should learn materials through contact with material, that you should touch things and set things in juxtaposition. And in the later Bauhaus moment, when Lily Reich comes to the school in 1932, you can see her creating a new type of interior in which you had very open spaces that were divided into functional areas, often with textiles as drapes or wooden wall dividers. And each functional area would have tactile surfaces, burnished wooden veneers, or fluffy sheepskin rugs, or rough textiles that would let the light in. And it would be almost monochromatic in tone, but full of tactile interest. So that's a later Bauhaus idea. Do you want to?
Even though the future belongs to Bauhaus wallpaper, we have to go on to the next one.
Okay. So Gropius was not at all interested in photography as an art. He thought of it as playing only an archival function or documentary function. But in fact, despite all of the talk of technology and industrialization at the Bauhaus, the machine that probably played the greatest role was the camera. And this is in part to largely, the moment of shift comes with the arrival of the Moholis, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and his wife Lucia Moholy. And they began to, in combination, push the throttle of the Bauhaus in a new direction. And Lucia Moholy, from the moment she arrives, becomes a kind of in-house official photographer of the Bauhaus, of activities, of events, of the buildings, of the products. And even though she wasn't named as a photography teacher, the school's first teacher of photography. And she, together with her husband Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, also are interested in theorizing a platform for photography and for media culture as a way of developing a new perception in the modern world. And here I want to stress that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, when he comes to the Bauhaus, doesn't speak German. So she's the one who's helping him write and formulate phrases, finding words for him. And that's a reminder that all of these great form masters, not all, I'm exaggerating now, many of these great form masters are not, in fact, just a single person. They're a couple. Mm-hmm. So Walter Gropius and his wife, Isa Gropius, and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and his wife, Lucia Moholy. They're actually double units in many cases, and both partners play a really important role in the activities and the theories of the school.
So although photography was very important at the school, practiced by many, it was not officially one of the workshops, so much later, until very, very late. And of course, this would get transferred to Chicago, where photography with Peter Hans was extremely important. One of the things I hope we can discuss, it's always, and I know many people in the room who probably can discuss this better than I, but just as I think it's interesting to go not just with principles, but also with questions. Of course, the camera was a 19th century invention, although it was going through radical transformations in this point, and the way of holding it and using it and the exposure times, as you can see in these deliberately oblique views, in which over and over again, too, the architecture becomes the subject of the photography. So the relationship between the architecture that's emerging here in the Dessau Bauhaus and photography is in and of itself fascinating. But photography permeates in many ways. But my question has always been, and I think the simple answer is, they just did not have the money to be buying tons and tons of machines, the way an architecture school now today brings in the 3D printers and all of the computer things for the next semester. Film, making motion pictures, especially given the fascination with time, with transparency, with sequence, and the extent to which, of course, movies were shown there, and they were fascinated with photography, and one of the Bauhaus books addresses this, but the actual making of movies does not seem, to my knowledge, to have been very much entering into the way of figuring the world.
No, they had another kind of modern holy grail, which was an abstract light and sound show. It was an animating dream for a lot of Bauhaus artists under Ludwig Hirschfeld-Mack. This idea that you could create something that would be light and sound, devoid of image, a sensory experience over the duration of time. In fact, it's like all the things that a cinema is, that film is, except a camera image. And that was something that different Bauhaus artists come back to again and again and again, much more captivating somehow than film itself was for Bauhaus students.
So the next point is this change in location. Now we know that the change in location from Weimar to Dessau, which happens in 25 into 26, was motivated, of course, by politics in Weimar. In turn, they would be, in a sense, invited to leave Dessau. So this is a very tumultuous political period. We'll be hearing more about that first thing tomorrow morning as we begin to work. But we put this in juxtaposition with our thinking about the role of machines, because I think it's also important outside simply what did the Bauhaus look like in both locations, that these are radically different places in Weimar, Germany. Obviously, Weimar, Germany takes its name from Weimar. The Constitution was there, passed there. The attempt at a republic was created there. This experiment with democracy is born in Weimar. But Weimar is also, of course, famously the city associated with the high point of German Enlightenment and Romanticism with Goethe and Schiller. I think there's already been reference by Herbert Bayer earlier to Goethe's garden house in Weimar. Weimar, a very small town with a relatively conservative population. Dessau was an industrial powerhouse. That's why today it looks a bit like the Detroit of East Germany. And one of the major, we picked this image of many that we could, has also to do with aerial photography. One of the major industries in Dessau was the Junkers aircraft industry. And so there was really the powerhouse of machinery, making heavy machinery, making airplanes, using heavy machines to create machines that were so light they could take you up into the air. So the fascination with the aerial comes from there. There's even a story that it might have been in the furniture that was designed for the production lines in Junkers aircraft, that a use of lightweight aluminum and of tubular bent materials despite the fact that Breuer always insisted that he came up with his furniture design by looking at bicycle handlebars. That might be anxiety of influence. He might have had a certain amount of influence by seeing what real industry, not artistically designed industry, was really producing in the Junkers aircraft factory, which was not that far away. So this move from the city that associates itself with the Constitution and with a poetic and intellectual heritage to a real industrial city, which then also was able to give the Bauhaus commissions for what we would call public housing, for housing estates, for an employment agency. So Dessau really became a very different field of action for the Bauhaus.
So if the overriding metaphor in the early years of the Bauhaus in Weimar was the craftsperson, the craftsman, the guild worker who could have potentially or metaphorically contributed to the building of a cathedral, in Dessau, the artist became a media worker, as somebody who was working with the tools of modern mass media and communication. The Bauhaus set up under Herbert Bayer, an advertising agency, that the school itself was a client as well as having outside clients. Photography became a major and important medium for expression, graphic design, and thinking about letter and mass communication. The Bauhaus became a publishing agency as well. So in that moment, you have a shift in the idea of what an artist could or should be. That's a pretty fundamental one. So for our last principle is the idea that the forces that ultimately closed the Bauhaus in 1933 sent its students and faculties in a diasporic range of directions. Major nexus of Bauhaus students, former students and faculty, ended up in Tel Aviv, ended up in South America, ended up in the United States, and that in many ways that the legacy of the Bauhaus became even more important after the Bauhaus closed. And that's not because students and faculty began creating objects that looked like the things that they learned about in the object, but a certain kind of ethos and a way of teaching was carried with Bauhaus alum. And I remember having a very keen feeling about this when we were organizing the show, and I saw something that was published in the Bauhaus magazine by Joseph Albers, in which he was describing his preliminary course. And he was writing about how important it was in the preliminary course to have contact with material. And he gave as an example, when we work with paper, we don't just paste it, but we suture it, we bend it, we sew it, we fold it, we tear it. And I thought to myself like this, that's Richard Serra. And what I was thinking about was his verb list, in which he created, which is on the screen now, a list of verbs in using the infinitive form largely, that reimagines sculpture as an operation, as an action, as something that you perform on some material. And looking backwards, you can see that that idea, thinking of art as something that you do to some material, is a fundamental Bauhaus legacy. And that doesn't sound like much of anything, like the idea that art is something that you do to some material, until you think about all the other things, all the other ways that art has been described. Art has been described as the direct imprint of the soul. It has been described as a sphere of pure autonomy. This idea that it's a very operational procedure where it's an action performed on some material has animated, I would say, almost all of post-war American art. And that came back to me later on when I was working on the Robert Rauschenberg show. And I should go back to say that Richard Serra was never actually a student of Joseph Albers, but he went to Yale and he became the person who did the press proofing for Albers' color theory book, The Interaction of Color. And he made an extraordinary video that you should look up and see on the internet at some time, called Color Aid, where he's flipping through Albers color papers with his dirty sculptor's thumbnails, because you can see all the grime from working with metals. In his almost like Oedipal gestures, he goes like this. So all of this weight came back to me when I was working on the Rauschenberg show and reading about Rauschenberg's relationship with Joseph Albers at Black Mountain College. He went to Black Mountain College to study with Albers, but he was never Albers' favorite student. But there he learned something about the idea, and he would say this, that anything could be art. The idea that art didn't have to be made out of a precious material, but could be made of things that you picked up and combined in different ways. In fact, the combinations was the watchword of Albers' class at Black Mountain College, and the fact that Rauschenberg called his most famous work combines is no coincidence. So one of Rauschenberg's most famous works is the erased de Kooning drawing, which he described as creating a drawing out of erasing. He asked himself the question, could he draw using only erasers? And he erased a drawing by Wilhelm de Kooning, who was the most celebrated painter of the time. And it seemed to me that that was a particularly poignant example of understanding art as something that you do to something, especially because Albers never allowed erasers in his class. So you have another one of these moments. I'm telling this in an anecdotal way, but there's a through line about understanding art in a very operational way that comes out of Bauhaus teaching that allows for work that is very different in the way it looks, in style, but a logic for art making that has profoundly changed what we understand things to be today. And I know you want to talk about diaspora in another way.
I do think that that returns us very beautifully to the point that we tried to make at the very beginning. So if the Bauhaus is a school, not a style, and the school only existed for 14 years, what subsists, so what persists? And I think Leah has made quite clearly that, first of all, I think we're going to discover over the next 2 days that in that 14-year period with 3 different directors and 3 moves of location, and if we put together a medley of things that came out of the Bauhaus, you would be hard put, if we chose them carefully, to say what Bauhaus style was. You would see such a diversity of experimentations, and of course, continual recalibrations as one director or one shift, even in a master in a workshop, might critique what had come before. So this very, very vibrant institution that's continually critiquing itself, continually experimenting. That idea of experimentation, in which some of the things Leah was just talking about, would survive, so that both Gropius and Mies van der Rohe would say once they came to America, poor Hannes Meyer didn't make that move, so he's not as celebrated in this country. We'll get to that in the coming days. But both Gropius and Mies could talk about the Bauhaus as having been an idea rather than a set of styles, and with the notion, very much in the context of the Cold War, that ideas are difficult to, you can fight them, but they're very difficult to kill. And so I think that's what we're going to be discussing very much over the coming days, this kind of dual motion of understanding just how diverse the Bauhaus was and not reducing it to one look or one set of things, at the same time as being open to the potency of what it suggested. And I just stop with one, maybe, and this will horrify you and you'll all kind of attack me first thing in the morning at breakfast, but, and it goes into the impossibility of the historical what didn't happen. So what would have happened if the Bauhaus wasn't closed after 14 years? The Bauhaus's closure, I think...
Robert Harris
yes,
now.
But the Bauhaus's closure has an awful lot to do with how we perceive it. Not only the conditions under which it was closed, but because it became something that was lost, that was truncated, and I think that those political circumstances also added to its potency and the urgency with which many who had been there took that name with them as they dispersed across the world. Not only to Cambridge, New York, and Aspen, but to Moscow, Mexico City, Santiago in Chile, Palestine, and many, many other places. So anyway, thank you for letting us open this august
Thank you.
event.
Thank you, Barry and Leah. Tonight's been a kickoff and a taste of what's to come. We celebrate Bauhaus in Aspen because of all that has come before, the bridge that was built, the design ethic established by Walter and Elizabeth Pepka. Much work to do over the next few days. So for last closing remarks, please help me welcome Kitty Boone and Warwick Sabin to the stage.
Okay, we'll be fast. I just have to say that it's so incredible to see so many people convened around art and art history. And really, that was the beginning of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. And let us not forget how important art and the making of art and the design and the thinking that went into that is so important to our society. I want to thank everyone who had such an incredible role in producing tonight. Deborah Murphy, John Melgard, Lissa Ballinger, Chloe Taba have done an extraordinary job with their teams in pulling off our set, our speakers, our beautiful dinner. Thank them. They've really worked hard for months and months and months to pull off this event. I think you're going to have an incredible time.
Yes. And we definitely hope tonight whet your appetite for the Bauhaus, because we're getting started bright and early in the morning with breakfast at 8 a.m., and all of our speakers will be available to visit with all of you for that first hour, and then we get the program going right at 9 a.m. We also have 4 exhibits that are on display here in this building and the one adjoining, and we hope you'll check those out. All of the information about those exhibits, as well as all of the information about the rest of the program over the next 2.5 days, are going to be available in the program guide that you will pick up on your way out the door. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Have a great evening.